Well, good morning. My name is Joseph Robertson, like you said. I'm a PhD student in the Computational Science and Statistics program, and I wanted to just kind of generally give you an idea about how we can use data science as kind of as another way to help with self-determination. Like Sarah's talk, a lot of our cultural ties come from giving back to our community to find some idea that, okay, if I'm doing educational or higher education, then how is it relative to the people that we serve in our communities? And definitely that's been the question that I've been really needing to answer, and especially being in computational statistics. How do I bridge that gap between qualitative nature of the stories we tell, but and ways that we can quantify that through STEM. And so what I'd like to do is kind of talk about the structure of today's talk. First, I want to give you an introduction to higher education and nation building, kind of from a native perspective. I'll go over my project overview, the data science and the new frontier of self-determination, kind of in my view. I'll give you an introduction to the Sisseton-Wahpeton Oyate, which I'm an enrolled member. I'll give you some background on my current research problems, some of the data that I'm currently analyzing, and some of my further research, some conclusions, and some final thoughts about persistence of students in STEM that are native and how we can do better with recruiting students just through, theoretical ideas. So to begin, I began my studies with looking at a lot of literature in federal Indian policy and law, and that was where I wanted to start. And I had a data set that I have from the tribe that I'm currently analyzing as a consultant. And so the idea around my dissertation was basically to have a narrative about, for me especially, my experiential experience in higher education is that, I'm one of the only Native Americans, I think maybe the only one in the math and stats department. And so that tends to be, when I went to Colorado State, I was 1 in 25,000 studying in the mathematics department. And so it's always been important to me to really look at, as an educator, now that I've been a math teacher for 4 years before I came back for my graduate studies, to really look at how do we frame higher education and the ideas that we can use to help educate not only our public institutions about Native Americans and their ideas, but how do we do that in order to create some sort of way to help recruit students to get more into STEM, into science. And so this was just a book I've been reading a little bit about, and I have some agreement with this, and this is just kind of where I wanted to start. The Association for Study of Higher Education, in one of their most recent education reports, states that higher education folds into a large agenda of tribal nation building and vice versa, and that nation building cannot be fully or adequately pursued without some agenda of higher education. And that's kind of where I wanted to start. We can't have education unless we weave in higher education into our native perspective of thinking and giving back to our community. Then I just don't see the point. So nation building that includes and infuses an economic development agenda, integrates indigenous values and leadership strength to develop actions intended to benefit present and future generations. This project focuses on understanding these relationships to fundamentally build this framework around data science and more specifically Indian data sovereignty. A nation-building approach recognizes that a big problem facing indigenous communities is a lack of job and income. And a nation-building agenda focused on economic wealth is not driven by the desire to reproduce wealth, reproduce material, consumer culture, or even uneven distribution of wealth. Economic development must not serve the material benefit of the owners, but must serve to improve the living situations for Native people as a whole and act as a vehicle towards economic self-determination that would validate and support cultural and political sovereignty. And so what my initial thoughts is through court cases and through a lot of decisions towards a lot of legal and political conceptualization of sovereignty, American Indian tribes have lost and suffered from eroded sovereignty as a result. And so I'm trying to conceptualize this idea of Indian data sovereignty as a new way of thinking for tribes to regain some of that sovereignty through quantification of science, of these qualitative ideas. Indigenous efforts to restore their autonomous power regardless of how it is termed, for example, Aboriginal self-government, Indigenous self-determination, or Native sovereignty, are founded on an ideology of Native nationalism and the rejection of models of government rooted in European cultural values. And that, to me, again, as Native people, we think differently. And so when we're put into this education system, there's certain expectations that we're not afforded because we think differently. And so I just wanted to mention that my department, the Math and Statistics Department, they've been overwhelmingly supportive of the ideas that I'm putting forth and giving me really a lot of freedom to be able to express what it is that I want to do with this and how it specifically ties back to my community. So here's my project overview. Is the purpose of this analysis is to assist the Sisseton-Wahpeton Oyate in developing a long-term statistical framework to integrate tribal census data with the tribe's current GIS systems. The tribe has a desire to use the unofficial districting areas to conduct further statistical comparisons with the US Census that uses a less specific method of census tracts. So again, the basis for my work is further examining the ideas of self-determination and tribal sovereignty beyond the legal and political definitions to provide a more modern approach to regaining eroded sovereignty through Indian data sovereignty. This term has kind of been going around a little bit in Indian country, but I wanted to capitalize on it, and I also have been just talking about branding data science to serve social justice purposes, not just data analytics to serve you an ad or to see what you liked or what you've shopped for, that we can actually use this data to really gain insight into our communities. I found this as I was doing some of my initial research. I found this. This was from a pamphlet that Vine Deloria wrote in 1975, I believe. And this quote is basically what I've been thinking about all along. And it was just, I found it interesting that I came across this, and I just wanted to read it to you because it really shows that there have been scholars already thinking about the things that I'm doing now, but I'm just wanting to have my own flavor on it. So Deloria was talking about moving past legal and political conceptions, and so he said that the sovereignty is a useful word to describe the process of growth and awareness that characterizes a group of people working towards and achieving maturity. If it is restricted to a legal political concept, then it becomes a limiting concept which serves to prevent solutions. The legal political context is structured in an adversary situation which precludes both understanding and satisfactory resolution of difficulties and should be considered as a last resort, not as a first instance in which human problems and relationships are to be seen. And I think even in Sarah's talk, when she was talking about literacy, and we're looking at this kind of idea that, we're always seeing, natives are always seen through a lens of maybe some sort of, in her case, it was Christian, so through a Christian lens, or for us to think of sovereignty as like just strictly a legal document. And so that's kind of the thing. We always go back to the common denominator of saying, well, if self-determination is part of the Education Act that was passed to help tribes manage their own education, then self-determination doesn't have anything else to do except for that when it's convenient. And so that's kind of what my interpretation of this is, that I want to move past that and try and help educate the public that these issues are more complex than that, and it's not just as easy to say there's one be-all statement that's got to reign supreme, because that's just not how the world works. So here I want to talk just briefly about data science. Data science is a huge exploding idea that's happening, and if anyone searches on Google or Yahoo or anything else for that matter, there are data analytics programs running underneath every web page that categorizes everything that you search for, and those analytics are used to serve ads or to see what types of things that you like, to see all sorts of demographic information. And so right now, data science is exploding, and there's lots and lots of things that we can use this for. I mean, a lot of, I'm working with currently census data, but I mean, it can there's financial analytics and healthcare and education. All those things are really starting to become part of this concept here. And so this is data science is just a growing praxis of these roles of things that have been defined by the American Statistical Association. So kind of the three things that we've decided on for the moment that's probably subject to change is first database management, which enables transformation, conglomeration, and organization of data resources. How do we store that data? Of course, my field, statistics and machine learning, that converts this data into knowledge, and that's what I'm after. And then we have distributed and parallel systems, where there are huge systems and cloud computing that provide computational infrastructure to carry out data analysis. I'm not at the big data stage, but you know, that's definitely an interest of mine. I mean, there's billions of lines of information that need to be analyzed, and we can gain insight from that. So I'm really wanting to get some more experience with that. So how can we translate data science into the conceptualization of self-determination? As I've talked about, self-determination really comes from from an act in Congress, and it's kind of thrown around in a lot of different ways. And like a couple of slides before, when I was talking about there's many ways Aboriginal self-determination or tribal or native self-determination, there's all these terms that have to do with that. So what I want to do is say, okay, I want to have this in the concept of looking at the self-determination through how we can further regain sovereignty that's been lost, and so how do we do that using science? Currently, I'm consulting on a census data project as a consultant with my home tribe, the Sisseton-Wahpeton Oyate, on the Lake Traverse Reservation. I've been working with the reservation planning department in developing a numerically based comprehensive planning systems to help further nation building in a number of capacities. And my current dissertation proposal is a direct result of working with my community and our collective desire to act on behalf of our tribal people. And again, that is the most important part of this, is that if I'm not doing this on behalf of my community, then it's just another paper for me to write. And so, you know, we all have these kind of conundrums in our lives where, you know, we want to find purpose in the things that we do. And it just so happens that as a Native person, you know, one of our strengths comes from our ties to our community. And so when this opportunity came up, it was an excellent fit for me to bring back to my department and pitch to them to say, this is important, so we should do it. And it's representative of our local tribe here that's close to South Dakota State, and is one of the reasons why I chose to attend South Dakota State, to help be representative of not only my territory of origin, but our education system as an American Indian person and a scientist. I want to give you a brief introduction to my home tribe, the Sisseton-Wahpeton Oyate. If you didn't know, this is kind of the general things that we know, that if you want to know about our people, this should just give you a brief synopsis. So the Sisseton-Wahpeton Oyate of the Lake Traverse Reservation is located in the northeast part of South Dakota, a small portion of southeast corner of North Dakota. The reservation boundaries extend across 7 counties, 2 in North Dakota, 5 in South Dakota. And I'll show you a map here coming up. Historically, Native Americans that comprise the Great Sioux Nation consisted of 3 major divisions of the Oceti-Sakowin: the Dakota, the Lakota, and the Nakota people. And currently, I'm a Dakota. The Dakota people are composed of the Medewa-Kantawan, the Wapekute, the Wahpeton, the Sisseton, and are the oldest of the 3 divisions. Since the inception of the Indian Appropriations Act, many of Dakota people call the Lake Traverse home. And today there are 7 political subdivisions located within the original exterior boundaries of the Lake Traverse Reservation. These districts were put in place shortly after the reservation was established. And each of these districts has their own community and are as follows. We have Big Coulee, Lake Traverse, Old Agency, Buffalo Lake, Long Hollow, Veblen Haipa, and Enemy Swim. And I'll go into a little further about why this is important, and these are the districts, and this is kind of the subject of my study that I'm currently doing with my dissertation. So I'm not sure if you can see it or not, but if you see, this is from Google Maps. So I mean, if you just go to Google Maps and come to South Dakota, you see there's some shaded areas within the state. And if you look right up here, there's a big triangle up there that's shaded in there, and that is the Lake Traverse Reservation. So there is recognition of the 9 tribes that we have in South Dakota that currently have a reservation. And so that's the focus of where I'm at. And you can see there's Brookings, so it's only about an hour north of here. This is a map that was created by the GIS CAD department at Sisseton-Wahpeton. And so part of my research is working with them to integrate this GIS into the current frameworks they already have. And so now, as you can see, the 7 districts here, if you look over on the left-hand side in the legend, notice it says the unofficial districts. And so what happens is that these are unofficial through a Supreme Court case, which I'll get into here in a minute. But what I'm really after here is that if we conduct a census through self-determination, then we want to use the enrolled members that are in each one of those districts, because that's how we want to do it. Rather, the census has another way of doing it. And so we'll just get into that right now. So the background of the current research problem I have is that there's been little research done in understanding how, through a series of Supreme Court rulings, the disestablishment of the reservation boundaries of the Lake Traverse Reservation has greatly affected the Sisseton-Wahpeton Oyate's ability to conduct a proper census analysis. And the complex and legal political context that defines Indian country is what is at issue here. And if you didn't know, there's a lot of legal jargon about how the Supreme Court has a degree of Indianness, of like what determines how Indian things are. And these are just non-published things, but they exist. And so another part of this is that Indian country, what is defined by Indian country? Is it within the boundaries of the reservation? Is it on allotted land, trust land? Is it where Indians live? Do a bunch of Indians have to be in one place to have it be Indian country? So these are complex issues that are not easy to figure out, but that's what I'm trying to make sense of. And since the Supreme Court that affected this decision was the Dakota versus District County Court ruling, the Supreme Court ruled that the state of South Dakota has jurisdiction over the vast majority of unallotted lands that are contained within the original 1867 boundaries of the Lake Traverse Reservation. Although the Sisseton-Wahpeton Oyate continues to have legal status as a sovereign entity, what is at issue here is whether the unofficial districting within the original boundaries can be used to assert self-determination when conducting the tribe census. So again, the boundaries have been disestablished, but yet the census, the federal census, uses these boundaries to conduct census, but they don't legally exist. And the state of South Dakota wants no part in this at all. They don't recognize the boundaries whatsoever. So there's a lot of conflict in determining what's what. The 1867 boundaries of the Lake Traverse Reservation enclose approximately 918,000 acres of land. This is from the District County Court ruling. So the numbers here, that within the 1867 boundaries there resides about 3,000 members and 30,000. That was in 1974. So right now I think there's over 6,000 or almost 7,000 members that live on the reservation now. About 15% of this land is in the form of Indian trust allotments. And these are individual land tracts retained by members of the Sisseton-Wahpeton tribe when the rest of the reservation lands were sold to the United States in 1891. Now, whether or not that actually is the way it went, that's the fact through the courts. So, but that's another story for another day. The trust allotments are scattered in a random pattern throughout the 1867 reservation area. That's why we call the Lake Traverse Reservation a patchwork reservation, because there's different tracts of Indian country within those boundaries. And the remainder of the reservation land was purchased from the United States by non-Indian settlers after 1891 and presently inhabited by non-Indians. So given this information, my question to address is, given the current question of sovereignty goes beyond the legal and political dogma, if Indian country refers to all lands within the boundaries of the Indian reservation, including fee land, and includes reservations, trust land, fee land, allotments, and dependent Indian communities, then by the Dakota decision, this is technically a paradox in which the census data that has been collected to assert self-determination cannot be recognized under either tribal sovereignty or self-determination. The issue is quite a difficult issue to resolve, and hence is the subject of my research. So it is not good enough to simply rely on the notion that it's okay to use disestablished boundaries as a matter of using the tribe's right to self-determination if the unofficial districts at some point in the future can again be used as a tool to erode further sovereignty. This is why this research is so compelling. To act as a sovereign nation, we must approach this problem in the concept of this notion. Indian data sovereignty can be a tool to make the case to counter this erosion through extensive statistical analysis and development frameworks. So the data that I obtained was from the Sisseton-Wahpeton Oyate Planning and Economic Development Department. The community planner had developed and designed and implemented the tribe's first census since 2006. The census was performed during the fall of 2014, and 484 households were sampled. The nature of the census question ranged from basic demographic information to questions involving housing, healthcare, education, income, and household members. The goal of this project is not only to create a comprehensive report of the census data, but create a comparative analysis of the current census tracts and redistrict tracts as shown in the next two slides. And due to the proprietary nature of the data and the coding of the data set, and due to the stage of which my proposal is in, I'm in the proposal stage actually, so I'm not a full-on PhD candidate yet. That the conceptual framework and the proposed data analysis is all I can provide at this point in time. So this is a map from ArcGIS. I just put this together real fast. And there's these things called shapefiles. They allow for polygons or maps or whatever, however you want to look at it, that we can represent things in maps, and then we can integrate data into those areas, and then we can do analyses in those. Here you can see there's the state of South Dakota. I overlaid the shapefile of the counties, so you can see all the counties are represented, and then you see all the purple stuff. Those are actually the tribal census tracts that are tracked by the United States Census, and you can get all these free from the Tiger Line shapefiles from the U.S. Census themselves. And so I'm interested in our reservation up in the top corner, but again, there is some work that's been done with GIS already. So again, here. This is kind of a more, this is more zoomed in. You can see the names of the counties surrounding the Lake Traverse Reservation, and indeed you can see the 2 counties up top, and then the 5 counties surrounding the Lake Traverse Reservation. You can see that this is a more complex issue, because if we want to use the reservation, we have to somehow get this data that's representative of 5 different counties contained within these 1867 boundaries. And so, and again, you can see that the the census divides the reservation into thirds, okay? And so does that give us insight to what the question I want to answer? Well, maybe yes and no, but I'm still trying to figure that out. So again, if you look at the comparison, we have the 7 districts that the GIS CAD department has been working on and developing, and we have the census. And not only that, but then we have data that I can get from the U.S. Census for each county. So the question remains is, okay, if we want to be representative of our people that live in each one of these districts, okay, then we need to do some work in figuring out how this is going to work, because again, we have disestablished boundaries. We have some recognition, some not recognition. We do have census. We do have a census shapefile that has information about it, but the tribe is more interested in doing this on their own behalf. And if they do, then the left side is the one that we need to figure out how to make this work. So my further study beyond the initial proposal, the nature of the data integration extends to a number of topics of interest. Some of the topics will be explored, but it is not limited to, number 1, spatial data frame integration into tribal districting shapefiles for analysis in R statistical software and ArcGIS. Those are going to be the two major tools I use in order to conduct spatial statistical analysis and kind of geocoding of a lot of the data that I have. Test for spatial autocorrelation, that's a way for us to determine what the relationships of things are and how close they are. So we can determine if certain people live in a certain area, do they all have similar income? And we can test to see whether or not that's actually true. And so test for spatial autocorrelation related to a number of census demographics of interest, and then verification using Monte Carlo simulation. So if we test for spatial autocorrelation amongst these districts, then we can run simulations to test whether or not this is not due to complete spatial randomness, that it could just happen by chance that this clustering happens. But considering that American Indians do live in housing developments, if you look on this map, if you have a closer view, you'll see there's housing districts in each one of these. So of course they're going to be clustered, but we also want to get at the fact that if there's people living on non-trust land or non-housing that's just private housing, okay, it's still within the boundaries. Is it defined as Indian country? So we need to figure out where the majority of people are. But we're also guaranteed that a lot of the Dakota people are going to be living in these housing developments contained in each one of those districts. And so the test, I want to design some tests, and this was part of the planning department. They were really wanting to work on comprehensive planning. So how do we do that? So the design of tests using survey, logistic regression models, or possible proportional odds survey analysis. Basically, in our statistical software, there's packages that allow us to take data, since census is technically like survey data, we can do statistical analyses on gaining insight from the data itself. And we can also look at the things that we collect, and we can run models to really look and see, are there relationships between things. So for instance, just an easy example is that if we code through healthcare, let's say we have some sort of blood pressure and we want to code, just do our people have some blood pressure below some sort of threshold, we can divide those into two categories, and if we think that we know what predicts somebody's high blood pressure, then we can run a model to see whether or not any of those factors are significant to that. And further comparative analyses using statistical tests, using cluster analysis or principal component analysis. That's another fancy way of saying that if we can divide up these groups into each district, can we see whether or not certain things exist between each one of the groups, or do they all share the similar socioeconomic or health or transportation needs? And then further design of numerical sample surveys that accompany further analyses using this framework. And that was a big issue for the Reservation Planning Commission. They're the commission that approves the kind of work I'm doing right now. And they were really interested in whether or not I could design sample surveys to give out at community gatherings in order for them to gain more insight about where it is that they need to put their planning dollars into economic development or housing or transportation. So my preliminary conclusions are the praxis here is to use data science and more specifically computational statistics to quantify the qualitative nature of previous theory and practice relative to American Indian law and policy to enact social and economic change from a nation-building perspective. And I think that's important because leading up to this, I always had the question about, if we know the history and we've done research on this, there's actually, somebody did dissertation research on the disestablishment of the reservation of Cheyenne River and Sisseton-Wahpeton Oyate and Lake Traverse, and that was amazing to me. It was a huge document. It has a wealth of information about a lot of this. So I wasn't going in blind about this, but what I really wanted to do is to take this to the next step. How do we quantify things using science? I mean, it's only good to tell the story. It's a whole nother thing to have some sort of way to back why it is that it is the way it is. And so that's really what I'm after here, is to be able to really break ground in looking at how to quantify all of these ideas that we have, and to help educate the public that if we have something like this, it's much easier to make the case for grants or to convince people that, the things that Indian people are suffering from in their communities is actually a real thing. It isn't just made up. So the framework being developed in the context, it can be used throughout Indian country for the betterment of Indian sovereign government and protecting their data from unintended further erosion of tribal sovereignty by realization of Indian data sovereignty. Another thing I came across is I think the Bureau of Indian Affairs versus the Klamath Water Users Resources, it's a Supreme Court case. The state of Wisconsin wanted the GIS data of a local tribe in Wisconsin, and when the Indians wanted to talk about with the state about why they wanted that data, they immediately took them to court, and of course the natives lost. And so now because we're an agency, we no longer are covered under FOIA. We're required, even if it's proprietary data or sensitive data like eagles, bald eagle nests, or sacred sites, that Indian tribes are subject to give over that information under FOIA. And so again, we have to be aware of these things when we design frameworks that have data in it, and that what we need to do is be mindful of those things, because it's not just about integrating data and putting it on a computer. It's understanding that these are important issues that really have to be addressed before we develop the framework. So furthermore, with framework development using tribal districting as an overlay to current census data, tribes will be able to measure the accuracy of vital statistics that have been a concern by tribes in misrepresentation of needs due to oversampling or any number of factors when compared to the U.S. Census. And again, if we can only tell the story, but if we quantify it, it can be something that really is something that we can move with to really make our case that we're not, our treaty obligations are real, and the government has a trust responsibility to help us as people maintain that relationship. So I had some final thoughts. Number one, this is the hardest part about trying to get Native American students into science, is that in the STEM fields, there's no way to explain to students how important it is that if you look at scientific principle, especially data science, that there's a way that we can help get these kids into programs like ours, to help to give them a context of how it is that this would be important for their communities. And again, I'm tied to my community, so it's important for me to know that what I'm doing here serves a purpose, and it helps somebody later on and some future generation that if they ever read my dissertation, they say, oh, that's how I can use science to help my community. Maybe I should do that. And so, these are all interconnected things. So, and then I talked about basically everything has to be revolves around higher education and nation building. And so part of that idea is then integrating data science and defining Indian data sovereignty as a way to combat these issues that are complex in the legal and political realm, and to really take this on from a scientific perspective. Again, to quantify qualitative ideas into something tangible that is beneficial to all Indian communities. So, for me, it's not proprietary. I'm putting these frameworks out to help all of our Indian tribes, move forward with 21st century ideas in education. So, just to finish up, again, I have this quote, and this is from Paulo Freire's Politics and Education. If you don't know who this guy is, he worked with a lot of peasants in Brazil, and talked about education through kind of the oppressed and oppressor class and oppressor classes, and how that critical consciousness and critical thought really has to be part of the conversation here. And I couldn't be in more agreement that as a holistic thinker, I think about things as a whole. I don't think of them as individual sum of parts, and that's a difficult thing because we're in a Eurocentric education system where we don't think that way. We don't think holistically. We're only told to look at these 5 things all in a row and don't make any inference about it. That's just the way it is. But for Freire, again, he talks about this idea between that we have theory and then we have practice, and how do we merge those two things and keep them comfortably separated in order to examine something through, for instance, an indigenous perspective. For me, that's what's important. What's more important to me also is to know that I represent this university, and that my department, through the theories and practices that they have, that they're kind of giving me an extension of this in order for me to pursue my theory about this topic that I'm working on. So for Airy, there is no theoretical context if it is not in the dialectical unity with the concrete context. Rather than call for the collapse of theory into practice, Freire argues for a certain distance between theory and practice. And he views theory as anticipatory in its nature and argues that it must take the concepts of understanding and possibility as its central moments. Theory is informed by an oppositional discourse that preserves its critical distance from the facts and experiences of a given society. The tension, indeed the conflict with practice, belongs to the essence of theory and is grounded in the very structure. Theory does not dictate practice, rather it serves the whole practice at arm's length in order to mediate and critically comprehend the type of practice needed within a specific setting at a particular time in history. And that time for me is now in data science and regaining sovereignty. There is no appeal to universal law or historical necessity here. Theory emerges from specific context and forms of experience in order to examine such context critically and then to intervene on the basis of an informed praxis. And that's really says it all of what I'm trying to do with computational statistics, to form a basis of informed praxis to change the paradigm of how we think and using that to quantify our data and to use that for self-determination. So with that, just some of my references here, and that concludes my talk. Any questions?
I think throughout I needed a definition of Indian tribal or Indian data sovereignty.
Yes.
But is it a definition of the boundaries for purposes of tribal policy decision making and for purposes of influencing the federal government and grantors? Is that what we're working on here?
I would like, in a more broad general concept, I view Indian data sovereignty as the ability of a tribe to manage, analyze, store, and use data as a representation of their own interests as a sovereign nation. And so it's more a general broad term to really, it's not been really developed a whole lot. But what I'm thinking about is being able to define that term in broad terms in order for tribes to say, if we have this data, then let's use it as a sovereign piece of who we are, and we need to preserve it. We need to preserve it as maybe like more of a, one of the sacred we hold sacred in modern 21st century thoughts. That's kind of my thoughts. If that data is precious, and so we should take care of it. And so that's kind of the idea behind that data sovereignty. Yeah, I mean, part of this is again, for the question that I'm trying to answer about the boundaries of our reservation is that we can't, like I said, it's tough. It's going to take an act of Congress for them to recognize the boundaries, not through the state as jurisdiction, but I'm kind of I have faith in the fact that if we make the case here, maybe we can go to Congress and say through census and our self-determination, we need these boundaries recognized. And under data sovereignty, that's how we want to do it.
Joseph, will your study be inclusive of the identification and protection of sacred sites? And if so, what are the complications with that?
Well, again, like I spoke about, I mean, one of those, that's an interesting topic. I mean, when again, with GIS frameworks, there's been a dissertation done on this, and it was from the University of Wisconsin, I believe, and it was just actually done in 2015, in this past May, that this person submitted their dissertation. And it really talks about this idea of we have to be mindful of the fact that the data that we get integrated or the data that we have as stored under some types of federal funding, if we obtain funding, or if we get, if we're have our data stored as a certain agency, then preserving those sites needs to be the utmost priority, because it can be handed over to any party whatsoever under FOIA because of the Supreme Court decision. And yes, I mean, this is what this framework is for, is to help educate everyone about the fact that if we have sacred things and sacred sites and we have them mapped into GIS data, that we have to take precautions to make sure that someone that's not acting on the benefit of Indian people, they have access to that, and we're legally bound to turn over that information to them. And a good example is just that as a result of that, that dissertation of the tribe in Wisconsin, that people looted sacred sites because they had the GIS coordinates of it. Any other questions?
Well, with regards to sacred sites, how are you going to implement legislation that does exist that does not have enforcement mechanisms like NAGPRA?
Well, I think, and that's kind of that's a difficult question to answer. And you know, when I was talking to my committee about the fact that with this data, there is that. I mean, that's what this Indian data sovereignty idea is about. Is that legislatively, again, these Supreme Court cases seem to be just always be giving the advantage to the other guy. And so again, how do we do that? Well, I think quantitatively, as a statistical consultant, that's the power that I have, is to be able to say, okay, if we have sacred sites that need to be preserved, then it needs to be brought to the attention that this is not okay for some agency to just come under FOIA request and request that we turn over all of our personal information. I mean, I think that's, you know, it's going to take an act of Congress to get our reservation boundaries, you know, reestablished. But, you know, anything's possible. In an infinite world of infinite possibilities, I'm not choosing the one or two things people tell me to do. And so I'm confident that maybe this concept that I'm developing can help be the next step in helping to lobby for legislation to protect those sites. Sure.
I like you ended your talk with Frery's kind of dialectic discussion of theory and trying to maintain that theory in a closer relationship to concrete realities. And so myself in the humanities, we heard a lot about data, census, and I think I want to know a little bit more about how census data is, maybe some examples of how it's been abused. I mean, how has the census data negatively affected the tribes today in some very specific ways? Can you talk about that? Yes. And how your project might correct that? One
of the things that, okay, when I started consulting with the planning department, they're interested in trying to develop a comprehensive 5-year plan. And what that entails is that I had a whole bunch of data, and when I had already published another report of a community assessment report, and they were looking for insights as to different demographics. For instance, who lives on and off the reservation if we sampled people. Another thing had to do with employment. I mean, Indian reservations have a lot of unemployment. A good example of this is that if you look at the U.S. Census, if you go to Roberts County, they say that unemployment is 7%. But my community assessment survey of the people sampled in this document that I produced, it was more like 30. So that's a big difference. And because of that, that's what I'm trying to get at too, is to say, okay, if we conduct our own census, we have the U.S. Census, we have these boundaries, and I can integrate and compare all of these things, and we can get to the bottom of whether or not we're being misrepresented. And a lot of this comes down to funding. I mean, if we don't have data and particular things to show governmental agencies that we're severely lacking in housing, then it's not easy to obtain that funding. Again, we had in in my report, there was 500 families under the Sisseton-Wahpeton Housing Authority that were in line waiting for housing. And so if you do a simple theoretical analysis of the housing shortage, you're looking at almost 40% of people are looking for housing, are looking for a place to live. And is that reflective of the state data that just says, okay, everything's cool? And so that's kind of like, but again, if we don't use our own techniques and our own self-determination to figure that out and make that comparison and make it concrete and make sure that it's done professionally, then again, it's another qualitative idea that's anecdotal and not provable, and that's what I'm trying to change.
I was just wondering, in your experience, how difficult is it to get tribes to encourage tribes to start collecting that data?
With anyone, data scares the hell out of people. I mean, it's like nobody wants to know only you want to know what you do on the internet, or anyone. People are afraid. But again, the history of Native people, we've been one of the most extensively studied groups in history. And a lot of it comes down to how do we take advantage of the Indians, or, can I be the token Native guy on the grant writing committee because we want to get a grant that represents underrepresented minorities, but we don't have anybody to make the case for it. So, could you be the poster guy for that? I think with the census data, there was lots of people that refused. They outright refused, and they don't have any trust in the tribal government any more than the federal government or the state government. And so that's what I'm trying to change, though. You got to start small. You have to start with a baseline set of demographic data, and when we can build on that, if we design and create this framework, then maybe our community will be better served. With this census report, I'm also producing a census executive summary with all the pretty pictures and all the non-statistical stuff that scares people away from reading it. It's more about a communal aspect. So not only am I doing this scientifically to help broaden the people that want to participate in this, but also to create things that allow the community to take pride in the data that we've collected and to help them give insight to what we want to do as a people and as a community. So people are very scared of giving out personal data of any kind.
I think there's other variables that have to be mentioned. One is that America doesn't have respect for the rule of law when it comes to tribal people, and that many of the things that happen to tribal people are the result of, abrogated treaties, policies that went against tribal self-determination, and then that brings in the question that we're not sovereign, we're semi-sovereign. And then the other issue is, besides the disrespect from the rule of law, is the contemporary public doesn't want to deal with the questions of what happened when they broke the rule of law in the past, that the current generations, how does it feel to be the children and descendants of thieves? I mean, that's a harsh thing, a harsh reality to have to deal with. And, the land was stolen. And so there's real harsh questions for contemporary people, and it has implications for how we treat people around the world.
I agree. And part of this dissertation is to step out of those bounds and to tell the story from our perspective. But again, you do it in a good way, and you do it in a way that helps educate people to say that in order for you to come to grips with our own personal history, especially locally, then we need to tell the story from a way that allows people to have a conscious, just like Freire talks about, is just this critical consciousness of being able to look at where we've come and where we're going and where we are right now. And so that's why my research, I think, is important, because we have to tell this story. And if it's in the archives of South Dakota State, maybe that kind of helps things further this conversation. And again, that's why I'm here. It wasn't by chance that I chose this university to attend and get my statistics degree and my PhD.
it is time for students to get to their next classes, so we'll have to end here. If you have more questions, though, I'm sure he'd welcome some discussion afterwards. We're taking a break until 1 o'clock, and we have Delphine Redshirt and then Billy Kingfisher at 1 o'clock and 2 o'clock, so I hope you'll come back. And we also have some books for sale in the back. Thank you.